Hi. I don't know how often I'll do this, but because this week was so chaotic, I wanted to take some time to recap our discussion, really, of the novel as a whole. I know some people have been able to take part in the synchronous meetings in our virtual class sessions, but even if you have been able to, you may or may not have caught everything or heard everything. I know there's been various tech issues. Um, if you haven't been able to make it, but you would have liked to, or if you just value hearing other people's perspectives, I mean that's the fun part about coming to class, right? I just want to kind of hit some highlights. I'm working from a handout that's a total mess, so I'm going to try and clean it up and get it posted on Canvas soon, but definitely not tonight. A couple other things just before I go into this. Check for some updates with scheduling. I do want us to read and have a virtual class session for next Monday, I think, or for this coming Monday. That's April 6th. I think initially I said that I had virtual office hours that day, but I want us to go ahead and start Olio and read that Monday and Wednesday, and then I'll do virtual office hours on Friday. Um, I'll lay that all out in Canvas. You might also notice that I pushed the due date back for the literary culture report. And that's because I didn't want people who were going to write a written response for the week to have two projects due on the same day. And then finally, if you weren't able to attend virtual sessions this week, remember 5% of your grade comes from class participation. So it's fine that you can come. I totally understand. The way to get that credit is to respond to that writing prompt that I put on Canvas. And I think I emailed it to you guys. Make sure you upload that to Canvas by 5 o'clock tomorrow. If there's problems or if you run into trouble, just let me know. Okay, so let's talk about Goon Squad a little bit. Um, so the very first day, I asked a question that kind of we came back to at the end of our last session on Wednesday, and it's a question I wanted people to think about as I read the last chapter, which maybe you've already done. Um, what is the resonance of all these different events? What is the story that's being told? If that even makes sense to think about, who's the main character? If that makes sense to think about. Um, do all these chapters add up to something, or are they just kind of fragments that remain semi-connected? And if, what's the rationale? What's the logic for that? I think the way I put it on the first day was, is this kind of a novel about the butterfly effect? Like, there's these small things that reverberate throughout the chapters. Or is it more like a web where people are connected, but it's not necessarily that what happens in chapter 3 is vital to what happens in chapter 10? I don't have a good answer to that, but it's something I want folks to think about. We've also talked a lot about the novels. A lot of people have used the word mental illness. Some people have used the word trauma. Um, all of the characters in this novel, all of the characters that we get, are featured at the center of a chapter. Um, I don't know how we want to describe them. If we were to say they were all mentally ill, I guess I would be worried that we might be flattening some of the idiosyncrasies of what make humans human. But clearly, kleptomania is a mental illness. Um, how does this book differentiate um, between mental illness and other kind of traits of humans, or what kind of comment is it making on that? What's going on in this novel with that? Because I mean, you all noticed that right away, that all these characters were struggling in certain ways. How's that connected to music? Adam made a great comment. These are saved in the chat transcript, so that's nice. So Adam talked about kind of the relationship between music and community. Some people talked about music maybe as a sort of antidote to trauma. So Adam's comment, music when played live requires a certain consciousness of the entire atmosphere, including crowd and fellow musicians. Um, and we always see characters kind of trying to situate themselves into their own communities, into their small communities, and sometimes or often that's a real struggle. So I thought Adam's thoughts about this sort of metaphor that music might be playing were really interesting. Um, Another part of our conversation has been about authenticity. and what this novel is saying about authenticity. We also I don't know that we've used the word integrity, which is associated with authenticity, but clearly not the same. And I wonder sort of what this novel is saying about both of those concepts. We pointed to a lot of parts in the novel. Um, um, Sarah pointed out that a lot of the characters seem to always want to put on a show, right? So, Bosco wants to put on a show. Dolly wants to put on a show with the general. Clearly, the members of the Flaming Dildos want to put on a show. It's a certain kind of show. And Cameron talked a little bit about the kind of the punk rocker aesthetic and sort of the trap of being authenticity. Some of the characters say, "Oh, so and so's a real punk, but I'm not a real punk." Which is weird for somebody who lives like in the Bay Area in the late 70s and plays in a punk band to say you're not a real punk. Um, but it just gets at the complicated nature of those concepts. Um, let's see some other comments I just wanted to review here. And Cameron also followed up, saying that sort of the paradox of authenticity, right, especially in punk or grunge or other sort of genres of music, is you know to be heard, you almost necessarily have to sell out. Um, you can play for five people and be super punk and super authentic, but then you're playing for five people. And if you play for 500 people, all of a sudden that seemed to be something really different, or in some quarters inauthentic. Um, let's see. Um, Sarah pointed out that authenticity is linked to the characters grasping for a sense of identity, um, and always believing that other people kind of know who they are. In other words, characters look at other people and they think, oh, they've got it all figured out. And as readers, we get to see nobody knows what the hell is going on. And that's kind of interesting. Sarah points out how Sasha steals things that illuminate others' identities. And that's kind of a way of creating her own identity. And so it's interesting if you look at the PowerPoint chapter, the second to last one in the book, now Sasha's found objects are things from her own life. And we might see them as ephemera, but they are things that are, creating her own identity. There are a lot of other comments here um, that I missed. Yi pointed out, one of the ways that meaning is made. So if we're thinking about authenticity, one of the things that defines characters, oddly enough, is how characters break away from each other. So losing touch and getting lost is something that sort of defines characters. I thought that was um, a really interesting point from Yi. Um, and then yeah, Adam got us back to this whole idea of like the trap of authenticity. He writes, Dolly is trying to construct an authentic general. Bosco wants the end of his career to be an authentic documentary by showing every aspect, but everybody knows it's an act. As long as you're trying to show authenticity, you've contradicted yourself. Um, and then the example that of people kind of speaking truth to power was Kitty speaking out against the general, but then of course she ends up maybe under threat of death, sort of becoming his girlfriend. So again, it shows the sort of limits of those notions a little bit in a really interesting way. Um, Okay, so this week we focused a lot on chapter 10, the Jewels chapter, the one of the footnotes. People noted that it seemed a fairly direct either homage or satire of David Foster Wallace's work, if you're familiar with his use of footnotes. Eric pointed out that one of the things that the footnotes did was they allowed Jules as a writer to place himself outside the situation. So he's in the dinner with the lunch with Kitty, but he's also kind of simultaneously outside of it, reflecting in the footnotes. And this is really interesting to me because we see characters doing that all the time. They're kind of in a moment and then they disassociate themselves from that moment. And as readers, we watch them do that. And a lot of people pointed to examples. Um, Several people, shoot, I thought I copied these over. Several people pointed to the drowning chapter with Robert. It's told in second person, and then we kind of so we're sort of detached from this character as he's going through this awful thing. Um, Benny seems to be kind of disassociating from his reality as a father, as a husband. Stephanie's so disassociated from her reality that she doesn't realize that Benny and her best friend are having an affair. I'm not saying it's her fault. I'm saying that she realizes at the end how obvious it should have been in retrospect. So we see these characters all the time kind of disassociating themselves. There are a lot of interesting thoughts. Again, thinking about form on the PowerPoint novel, people thinking about how people communicate now, what Egan's thoughts are about how people communicate now. Um, Ryan pointed out that he thought the chapter, that PowerPoint chapter, was an interesting visual representation of how the characters' thoughts were being processed, and if it was um, an allusion to how we communicate now in the age of the internet with text and images, and maybe a reflection on the parts of language we take for granted. Because there's so little language in that chapter, you really kind of are forced to focus on every element of it, which is really interesting. I wanted to ask, because of that chapter and because of our reading of that William Paulson article, what is this essay saying about technology? What is it saying about information and the information age? The question that Paulson asks is, or I think that Paulson would ask is, how does this novel fit into or strain against the technological mode of our current society? Is Egan critiquing kind of the PowerPoint, the sort of that mode of communication that moves away from language? Is she celebrating it? Is she just kind of reflecting on it? And then kind of, I guess the last point I'll leave you on, and maybe one to think about if you haven't read the last chapter, if you have, if you are just kind of think about the novel as a whole. Um, and this again goes back to Paulson. He talked about writers and critics. Their job is to kind of separate the important from the unimportant. So critics, say, okay, well, this work is important. It should last. It should be read. This work is unimportant. Um, and writers do that too when they're writing novels. This is a book that really kind of, I feel like, pushes that or makes us think about it. What is Egan telling us is important? Why do we get certain fragments and not others? Several people in class, and I can't remember all of you, these are really good points, kind of link that idea of the pauses in the songs to the sorts of uh, the ellipses or the blank spaces in the lives of the characters, the things that we don't get when we move from chapter to chapter, the things that aren't narrated. And so I just wanted people to reflect a little bit more on the decisions that Egan's making in terms of what to represent and what not to represent. And if you can come up with a logic to it, if you don't think there's a logic, and if so, why not? What's the effect of that? I know this is in the writing prompt, etc. So I'm leaving it unanswered now, obviously, but that's something I'd really like you to think about as you read. We'll probably talk about it in the virtual session tomorrow for those that can be there. Again, it's something, if you can't be there, that I'd like you to write about. I have my own thoughts. I'll keep them to myself for now. Let me know if this was helpful to you. If it's not a ton of work, I'm happy to do it. It helps me kind of organize my thoughts about the book. But if it's redundant or not that helpful, that's fine too. So if this is something you found really helpful, please do let me know. If you thought it sucked, you probably, that's okay. You don't need to tell me that. But otherwise, I do want to make sure I hear from everyone tomorrow, either in our virtual session or submitting a written discussion. I just don't want to lose track of anyone. If you're having difficulties or if there are things that you can't do or timelines you can't make, just let me know. I'm happy to work with you. But again, we're all really isolated, and I don't want to lose touch with anyone, because before you know it, the end of the semester will be here. All right, stay healthy, guys, and I'll talk to y'all soon.